Welcome back to the Dynasty Locker Room podcast. This is episode 12, where we're going to touch on some important pickups and some important schedules to monitor for your fantasy hockey playoffs, whether you're in them starting or you got them starting here next week or a week after. Definitely something to be looking forward to and exciting to break that down on the podcast. With me for that, I got Tessmonster. Tessmonster, excited to hop into this hockey podcast with you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be a fun one to break down. Fun to finally get a fantasy hockey podcast rolling. We've been rolling with it all season long for waiver wire pickups, position rankings, but it's fun to get on the podcast and really decipher what we're going to do with our fantasy hockey seasons down the stretch. I know you and I have been eliminated in our one big league. That doesn't mean we're not looking forward to next year, grabbing some hot hands off the waiver wire as a stash or maybe some prospects now that the Frozen Four is winding down. Guys are signing with their National Hockey League teams. Some fun talent coming in from there as well.
Yeah, definitely exciting times here in Minnesota. Go Gophers. Got to represent us in the Frozen Four here coming up next week. So that'll be something to watch outside of the NHL. But why don't we dive into what teams and divisions we're watching here for the hockey playoffs coming up?
Yeah, Tyler, one of our contributors, is a very casual hockey fan. And the other day we were having a conversation about the playoff race. And it's really funny because the Eastern Conference always seems to be so swayed, top heavy, whatever words you want to use. But, we basically see the Eastern Conference basically already decided. Seeding is a little up in the air, but we know exactly which 8 teams are going to be in it. So that's not going to be as fun to watch for me down the stretch. What I'm more interested in is seeing how the West shapes up. I mean, you look at the Central and the Pacific divisions, and you've got Dallas and Winnipeg still chasing down a wild card spot. Out in the Pacific, it's even more tight with the Kings somehow sneaking into the number 2 spot, Edmonton and Vegas right behind them, and Vancouver on their heels. So the West is always going to be fun to watch, but the Minnesota Wild for us have been fun to watch of late, rattling off 7 in a row. They're not going to catch Colorado, but for seeding purposes, it would be nice to have some home hockey games.
Yeah, always excited to go to the XL and see some of that hockey playoff atmosphere in there. So that'll be definitely exciting for us to look forward to and having it pretty much locked up, being ready to go into there. So why don't we skip away from the NHL and dive into your fantasy hockey playoffs? So let's look at the waiver wire and some of these exciting players heading into the playoffs. And we'll start with the forwards. And you have somebody like a Brock Nelson out there who's been recently hot with 12 goals in his last 14 games. Tessmonster, what are some other players that you're looking at here in the forwards?
Yeah, I mean, to touch on Brock Nelson briefly, you see him red hot lately, not only with the goals, but he's got 9 points in his last 5 games, blown his previous high water mark out of the water with 32 goals this year. Definitely somebody I'm looking to definitely down the stretch to give you a nice boost in goal scoring, certainly in your points league. So definitely a guy to keep your eye on there. Some other guys I'm keeping an eye on for sure. Jacob Vrana for the Detroit Red Wings, recently activated from his injury, and he's been red hot as well. He's got 8 points in his first 10 games back with the squad, 5 points in his last 4 games, and he's skating with Tyler Bertuzzi and Pius Suter at full strength. So definitely a guy I'm keeping my eye on as well. We see a guy who was just traded and got into his first game with Colorado last night, Arturi Lehkonen. I'd love to hear Nation pronounce that name.
Good one.
We saw him skating on the second line against Calgary last night with Alex Newhook and Burakovsky, also getting some second unit power play time. So he could definitely sneak into the lineup and be quietly productive, especially with the number of big name forwards out of the lineup, like Gabriel Landeskog right now. So definitely a guy I'm keeping an eye on. He lays the lumber a little bit. He's averaging a hit a game, half a block a game, which is great for a forward. So definitely a guy I like for points, but he's going to chip in your peripheral stats as well in your banger leagues. While we're talking about banger leagues, I'm not going to sleep on Keegan Kolasar. He's widely available, and he's going to lay the lumber. He's averaging 6 hits per game over the last 8 games, absolutely shredding guys on the boards. He's putting up shots and blocks as well. averaging 0.6 blocks per game, over a shot a game, and quietly having a nice season with 21 points for Vegas. Definitely a guy I didn't have on my radar at the start of the year, but definitely a guy in banger leagues who can really put you over the edge when we're looking into the playoff season. The second group of names here, it's going to be guys I'm looking to stash maybe down the road, either for next year or years after. The first one is Yakov Trenin and Tanner Jeanneau, both playing for Nashville. Trenin has been pretty good of late. They're both playing on the same line. Trenin's got 17 goals and 7 assists on the year, and he's been playing quietly very good between them two and Colton Sissons leading that line. Definitely a presence. He's averaging over 3 hits a game and definitely contributing in the shots department with 2 per game as well. Can't sleep on Tanner Jeanneau. He's got over 20 goals this year in his rookie campaign. If it weren't for some of the higher names on the list, he could be getting some Calder consideration as well. Another name I'm not sleeping on for next year is Brandon Hagel, recently traded from Chicago to the Tampa Bay Lightning. They coughed up a 2nd-round pick to get him. So I think down the road there's going to be a role for him. Hasn't really contributed yet, but he's skating 3rd and 4th line minutes right now. I think that they're going to be penciling him into that Andre Palat role for next year. So this is a guy definitely I'm keeping my eye on. I think he could be sneaky to approach 50, maybe 60 points next year. So guy I like a lot. He doesn't hit or block as much as some of our other banger league guys that we really like, but he's definitely a guy I'm going to be monitoring, especially as the playoffs come into shape this year.
Some good names to know there, especially for a team like mine that has been eliminated from the playoffs and definitely looking to rebuild. So good progression. Hoping to see some of these guys make their way into the second line and earn some more minutes moving forward. And now let's head over to some of the defensemen that are really exciting for your playoffs and the future. And one of those names I see here is Eric Cernak, and that's a player that always ends up on my roster every season and somehow gets cut in the offseason. What do you like about him?
Yeah, I mean, Sharrod is a guy that we've talked about quite a bit in depth. There's a ton to like about him from a banger league perspective. I think he's a little bit under the radar, though, because he's been so injured this season. He's only suited up for a handful of games so far, but definitely a guy we can count on for hits and blocks, more than 2 a game, and he's going to put some shots on goal as well. Probably get a nice plus minus if your league counts that. So definitely a guy I'm looking to there as well. Another guy that we're talking about, if we're going to go banger league, let's go all in. Ben Sharrod, recently traded to Florida from Montreal. He's been getting into some games lately after his, with the 10 games that you had, or 10 days you have to sit out, moving from a trade with the regulations for COVID between Canada and the U.S. He's been getting back into the game, and we saw him deliver. He's been putting up hits and blocks all year. Nothing has changed since he's gone to Florida, especially with Aaron Ekblad out of the lineup. So he's skating some big-time minutes. Guy I expect to produce down the stretch, and looking forward to a playoff run from him in Florida. Another guy who was traded is Hampus Lindholm. Went from Anaheim to Boston. A guy I expect to see a big uptick in his point production, some nice peripheral numbers as well. So some of the traded guys are going to have a really high ceiling. Going elsewhere, another guy in Florida I like is Gustav Forsling. Definitely not a huge peripheral guy, so if that's what you're looking for, you're out of luck with this guy. But he's quietly put up almost 30 points this season in a non-power play type of role. So definitely a guy I like to get you some points if you're looking for defenseman points down the stretch and in the playoffs. Another guy who's going to do that for you is Shawn Dursey from the Los Angeles Kings. He's stepped into a power play role with the Kings with Doughty being hurt out of the lineup. He's stepped into the forefront and really delivered. He's got 6 power play points in the last month, and I really expect that to take off. He's put up some nice peripheral numbers, nothing crazy, but a hit and a half a game, a block and a half a game is always something nice that can be chipped in for as well. Moving over to the Eastern Conference, a big one for me has been the emergence of Cam York on the power play unit 1 for the Philadelphia Flyers. He's kind of taken the reins of that over some of the more established guys like an Ivan Provorov, Some of the other guys that are there have run power plays in the past, like Keith Yandel, that Nation knows also well. But he's kind of taken the reins there, and with Philly not looking so hot this year, no reason not to let him see if he can take the torch and run with it. So definitely a guy you should keep your eye on as well. And we'll round it out looking at Chris Weidman in Montreal. He's stepped into the forefront on power play duty with Jeff Petrie out of the lineup, producing 7 power play points in the last month. That's really exciting for a team that's really taken off now that Martin San Luis, the coach. If you're in need of power play points, especially on your blue line, definitely a guy I'm looking to target.
Yeah, Keith Yandel has been one of those guys that's been a staple in my Dynasty team for years and years. Unfortunately, you run into that old age and having to release him from my roster. One thing I noticed on your defensemen here you've been talking about, usually in the waiver wires for defensemen, you're targeting hits and blocks, but it seems like there's a lot of defensemen available after some trades and some injuries that are producing it on the power play and getting you some points. Is that something new, or is that something you were looking for specifically for the playoffs here?
No, I mean, it was really interesting to see how it shook out. And obviously the trades had a lot to do with that. I mean, you've seen, Sharrod and Hampus Lindholm be moved, and a lot of other guys have emerged. You've also seen injuries to guys like Drew Doughty forcing Shawn Dursey to the forefront. And, when we're looking, obviously we're looking from a points perspective as well as a peripheral perspective as well. But to see the number of guys who are doing both that are so widely available, it seems like in many of our leagues. And a lot of the ownership that I go off is based on Yahoo. So if Fantrax or something else has different ownership, so be it. But a lot of these guys really can step in and produce for points and peripheral numbers as well.
Yeah, it's definitely a big thing out of a defenseman, especially with how few people are putting up kind of all the categories there for you in your banger leagues with the peripherals and points and being on power play 1. So finding those late in the season could definitely be a huge boost to your team. And staying towards the defense, but going towards goalies here, there's a few goalies that we think could make a big impact on your team down the stretch. One of them that I'm looking at is Antti Ranta, and I think with Carolina having their playoff spot locked up, you're going to see some more frequency of Frederik Andersen taking a seat and getting some rest for the playoffs. And Ranta has been really good over his past 6-7 games. So I'd expect him to hopefully continue that and give you some boost in your goaltending if that's one of the areas you're lacking. And what do you think about him, Tessmonster?
Yeah, that's a great take. And, sticking in the East there with Carolina, there's now that 8 teams have all but locked up their playoff spots, I wouldn't be surprised to see some of those teams give their starting goalie a night off, especially against some of the weaker opponents that they face down the stretch. So that wouldn't be a surprise to me at all. Looking towards the West, I'm not sure how prevalent that's going to be. We've seen Colorado basically lock up the top spot in the Central, so wouldn't be a surprise for me to see Pablo Francouz suit up a little bit more often over Darcy Kemper. But some of those names in the West, I wouldn't be so itching to grab that back up off the waiver wire. Some names I am looking at, Karel Vejmelka for the Arizona Coyotes. He had that stinker of a game against Edmonton the other night, but when we look at it, that was his first really bad start since the beginning of February. So we're looking at a goaltender that's putting up pretty good performances night in and night out, despite the lack of a team in front of him. So that's really interesting to me, and definitely a guy I'm looking to maybe save on my roster heading into next year, especially now that he inked a new 3-year contract and Scott Wedgwood is out of the picture altogether. So that's pretty exciting to me. Another name to monitor, I think, if you're looking for goaltending depth, if you're a playoff team, keep your eye on Craig Anderson. The Buffalo Sabres have a handful of games next week. Wouldn't be surprised to see him get 3 starts over that stretch. So definitely a guy, maybe you're not looking for wins, but if you're looking for reliable save percentage or goals against numbers, could be a good guy to stream down the stretch.
I know there's another guy that has been sitting on my IR for a long time here, Mckenzie Blackwood. Have you had any news about when he's making a return, and would that be somebody you'd stash on your IR right now if you had an opening for kind of that playoff push at the end?
I haven't heard anything myself, but I know when he's been in the lineup in the past, he's been highly effective. And we've seen Nico Dawes down the stretch kind of waver a bit. He was a nice story initially, coming in and providing some really nice starts for the New Jersey Devils, but that's kind of gone by the wayside, and he's had some stinkers of late. So I wouldn't be surprised if Blackwood is back and healthy. Wouldn't be surprised at all to see him get into the lineup regularly down the stretch, get him used to playing in games again.
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be could be a big pickup as well. There's definitely some goaltending opportunities out there, as you've pointed out. So rounding out your roster there, if that's one of the things you have been lacking, and you're looking to steal a few extra points here and there, would be a good spot to look at here. And this is a really good time now to jump over and look at some of these playoff schedules and why you should be monitoring them. With all the COVID issues that we had going on, you can see an imbalance of games being played for your playoff week. And that starts with Vegas and Chicago only having 2 games. So you want to definitely steer clear of those teams when you're making some ad drops if you can. And Tessmonster, you've been monitoring this as well. What other teams are you looking at for their schedule?
Yeah, so this is something we've definitely been looking at as we head into the home stretch here. We see Vegas and Chicago only having 2 games. That really impacts, the game load of a guy like Dylan Strome for Chicago, who's been red hot of late. But if you're only getting 2 games out of him, I might look elsewhere, especially, in weekly leagues for sure. Something I'm looking at is the Pittsburgh Penguins playing 5 times next week. So you'll want to make sure you're getting guys like Evan Rodriguez and Jeff Carter in your lineup to get some extra points. If you're looking to get some extra blocks, Brian Dumoulin is definitely a good option there, as well as Chad Rudwell and Marcus Pettersson in the blue line for some hits. Also of note, Boston, Columbus, Toronto, Tampa Bay, St. Louis, Calgary, Carolina, Buffalo, Ottawa, Dallas, and Nashville all play 4 times next week. If you're looking for some names that you can get into your lineup for those 4 games, I've got a couple jotted down here. Eric Hall has been red hot for the Boston Bruins as well, putting up some nice point totals, and he's surprisingly turned his game into one that embraces more contact, so you can get some nice hits there as well. Oliver Bjorkstrand for the Columbus Blue Jackets. He's had some nice production of late. Definitely a guy who's not afraid to put the puck on the net. So if you're looking for some shots on goal, definitely a guy I'd look at. We've seen Tyler Toffoli look quietly very good with the Calgary Flames. Definitely somebody worth putting on your roster if he's available. With 4 games and Calgary clicking, it seems, of late, he's definitely a guy playing on the second line and on the power play that can definitely impact as well. We already talked about Eric Cernak for Tampa Bay. Definitely worth an ad there. Casey Middlestadt for the Buffalo Sabres, a guy we've been touting at the Dynasty locker room all year, not just because he's a Minnesota guy, but because he looked so good at the end of last year. And we've seen him do that this year when he's been healthy. That when he's been healthy has really been the question mark. And then for Nashville, we talked about Yakov, Trenin, and Tanner Jeanneau. Definitely some guys you can get in the lineup. They play on that third line, but we've seen them be very productive at putting up points and hits. So those are some of the guys I'm targeting.
Yeah, definitely Pittsburgh, if you can use your ad drops towards the end of this week, if you already have your playoff spot locked up, to get those extra games from Pittsburgh before your ad drops go into next week is a good strategy moving forward, especially when you monitor the combination of schedules with some of those hot waiver wire pickups. Being able to get ahead of the game with some Pittsburgh players or any of those teams that play 4 times, and then being able to use some of those hot waiver wire players like Kolasar to get some hits here and there for the 2 games that they play as well, using your ad drops. So something to go back and forth and monitor between schedules and some of those hot waiver wire pickups to fully round anything else out. Was there anything else you wanted to touch on here, Tessmonster?
Yeah, I mean, I know we've been talking about it too when we look at the fantasy hockey playoffs and what somebody's going to do to try and eke out a win, in a given week. Do you think this has any impact on changing your strategy for how you attack your categories if you're in a roto type of format, or does it not change?
I definitely think this is one area that is often overlooked is when you're talking about kind of ad drops. You see the big waiver wire claims here, and you see maybe a Brock Nelson really hot, so you go and you pick him up to get a bunch of goals. But if you're looking at the team you're playing in week one and you're projected to get beaten goals by a lot, you should, instead of focusing on trying to get to that category and be above average and where you're at, go focus on the categories that are close. Go focus on the categories that you should be winning, because you're, at the end of the day, your goal is to win just one more category than the person you're going up against. So evaluating your team and the team you're going against is something that's often overlooked in a lot of ad drops I see during the playoffs, and a really simple thing to give you a better edge on eking out a game when you're a 4 seed going against a 1. What do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing I think I look at a little bit more heading into the fantasy hockey playoffs is taking a look at your matchups, especially for your goalies. I mean, if you see, you've got Philip Grabauer saying he's going up against Edmonton, that's definitely not a start I'm looking to make. But in the same sense, if you see, a light schedule for somebody like a Craig Anderson or a Vejmelka, who can come in and put up some nice numbers regardless of whether or not you pick up a win, I think that's definitely something I'm looking at a lot more. It's one of those things. It's just like fantasy baseball, fantasy hockey for those goalie categories. If you can get the save percentage and the goals against, you run into that battle of, okay, well, do I try and put up more win and save totals, or do I go the opposite route? So it's definitely a balancing act. And if you can get the better starts, I think that's definitely something I'm looking for, especially early in the week.
Yeah, find those good matchups early in the week, and maybe looking at your opponent's matchups as well, knowing if they have some tough matchups coming up, you might be able to sneak out a couple of your tougher matchups in there too, to be able to compete with wins and saves instead of having to sit him there. So definitely being aware of your opponent's matchups, your opponent's projected totals in categories, and really just focusing on trying to get those 7 out of 13 categories to be able to give you that win over there and move you on to the second round. That's where a lot of those first round upsets come in.
Absolutely.
And that wraps up kind of your dive into some of these prospects or some of these waiver wire pickups with some of the schedules for the fantasy hockey playoffs. Tessmonster, what do you got coming up here in the future as far as articles and podcasts?
Yeah, look forward to, obviously, we'll continue the waiver wire post throughout the end of the year. So be on the lookout for that. Some of the names that we mentioned earlier this year are definitely going to be relevant as we go down the stretch as well. So any of the previous waiver wire posts, I think, are still mostly relevant there. Definitely looking forward to some fantasy baseball content coming up here in full force. As opening day is a week from tomorrow, so that's pretty exciting as well. And looking forward to finishing up the fantasy baseball podcast with you and Tyler, getting through our top 50 players. That's going to be pretty exciting from a dynasty aspect. So really looking forward to rounding that out, getting to watch some baseball, watching some fantasy hockey down the stretch, and some playoff hockey for sure, especially as the Frozen Four comes up next week as well for our Gophers.
Yeah, exciting time for kind of the sports, with baseball starting, with hockey coming to a conclusion. And I think one of the things I'm excited about too, as far as the Dynasty locker room goes, is dropping some more fantasy football content. We'll have some of those rookies to monitor, especially as the draft approaches, and seeing all the players finishing their pro days and where their rankings have changed, who you're looking to target, how you're looking to target players in your rookie draft, and building off of kind of how do you build a dynasty team podcast that we had before with Jason. So that'll be a lot of fun to dive into as well. And always rounding out our fantasy baseball. It'll be really fun to dive into kind of the differences that we have in the first 5 rounds of your fantasy baseball draft. So looking forward to all the things we have upcoming here. Any last words before we sign off, Tessmonster?
As always, make sure you come find us at the Dynasty locker room. Lots of content there always coming. Make sure you go look for me on Twitter or on Reddit, DLR Tessmonster. Pretty active there as well. Come ask your questions, swing by the forum. Make sure you sign up there, ask us, and interact with all the other fans there. Definitely an up and coming area on the Dynasty locker room. And like and subscribe and anything you want to do.
Absolutely. And again, we're finishing up our DLR fantasy baseball draft right now. I just had somebody steal Ty France for me, so I'm not very happy about that. But we'll definitely be sure to round out that draft, talk about some of our favorite picks moving forward. As always, you can find me, Nation DLR, everywhere on Twitter, on Reddit, at thedynastylockerroom.com. Like, subscribe, give us a follow, and until next time.